So, hello and welcome everybody. My name is Dan Rodney. I'm going to be presenting today's live stream. I'm an instructor and a course developer here at Noble Desktop in New York City. We're a training center that teaches all sorts of design and code related stuff. So we teach web design, a lot of Adobe applications, and today we're going to be taking a look at Photoshop. And specifically, we're going to be retouching a photo and doing some kind of creative effects to it. And in the process of working on this particular project, you'll be learning a lot of concepts that you can apply to other images, not just this particular image. So we like to show not just a feature here or there, but we like to show it in context. So I think people learn best if they see an application of a feature, not just, hey, here's this feature in kind of a random demonstration. So lots of concepts will be covered on this particular image, and we've actually got all the instructions written down for you, and I'm going to show you our website where you can download an exercise actually. So after watching this video, if you want to try it out yourself using a step-by-step exercise, you can go ahead and download an exercise and the images and everything that I'm going to be demonstrating with, so you can do it yourself. But during the live stream, or if you're just watching this recording video later, you can just sit back and watch the video and just concentrate on the concepts that I'm covering, and that way you don't have to worry about trying to follow along at the same time. Just a couple words about Noble Desktop. We've been in New York City for 27 years, teaching all sorts of Adobe apps and code if you want to create web pages or emails, and a lot of our classes can be attended online as well as in person in New York City. Of course, you can always come to New York City, and it's a great place to take our classes in person, but if you can't make it here, I know a lot of people watching this video are going to be in other countries or other states, and you can do a live stream into the instructor's computer, hear them speaking, and you can attend almost all of our classes live online. You do have to attend live, just like there's going to be people in the classroom. You would live stream into the instructor's computer, so it is all Eastern time. We're based in New York, but if you can't take a class, or if the time difference doesn't work for you, there's also some great workbooks that are on our website as well, and those are great for you to check out. So enough about that. Let's go ahead and get started today. I'm going to switch over to do a screen share. So now you should be able to see my screen. Now this page is a secret address on our website, this nobledesktop.com/goodies. It's not the same goodies button as over here. That's a different thing. This is a secret page that you have to know the address to get here. There's no link on the website. It's secret. We just tell people that are watching these presentations and coming to our seminars. I'm going to paste this into the chat for those of you who are attending live. There also will be a video in the video description, the info area down below the video. I will also paste that link when this is a live, when this is a recording. So if you're watching the recording of this, just check the description down below the video, and there should be a link. Or you can just go to nobledesktop.com/goodies. There. And then down here, you can scroll down to this. We have instructions for CS6, CC 2017, and we have also the class files. And if anything changes in the future, of course, we'll be updating for 2018, whenever that comes out. So we keep this page updated if anything needs to change for future versions. Typically doesn't very much, so it shouldn't be a problem, but it stays pretty similar for this particular project that we're working on. The class files are the image, beginning version and a finished version. So let me show you what we download as part of that. So here's the download. We've got a Photoshop file for the beginning version. I'm going to open that up in Photoshop. I'm just going to do a fit on screen. We kept this as a low-res file. It's not a super high-res big photograph, just to keep it a little bit more simple to work with, and so it's a super fast download for you. I'm also going to open up this JPEG as well, just so you can see the finished version. This is the before, and this is the after. So I'm going to be just hitting Control-Tab here, switching back and forth a few times so you can see the before and after. What we're trying to do here is take what's kind of an ordinary photograph and reimagine the color, but it's not just color and contrast. Like, we're kind of changing the feel of the light here a little bit with that color change. This is like a dull, dreary fall day that you don't really feel like grilling on, and we tried to make it feel more like it was summer and it was warmer out and you felt like grilling, actually. But beyond that, we also this particular image, not only was it cold, but it was kind of harsh. There is a lot of detail in there, but it's not necessarily attractive detail. We tried to make it a bit softer, give it a little bit more warmer, softer feel. And so there's some selective focus going on here, that some parts of the image have been kind of blurred out. Not all the parts, just some parts. So the unimportant areas, we're kind of blurring the details out so that you can focus on some of the more interesting details that are in the image. And there's going to be some really interesting techniques for doing that. We have a really cool way to do that, and that's a great technique. So a lot of these ideas, even though we're doing it to this image, you can do it to pretty much any image once you understand the concepts behind it. So we'll learn lots of different techniques as we go along working with this. Oh, that said, let's close up the finished one and get started. And like I said, I'm going to show you all this all this stuff, but if you ever want to do this afterwards and you don't want to watch kind of following along, just go through that exercise, and literally everything is written down step by step. All the keystrokes, any menu items, it's all written down in that exercise. So everything that I'm going to be talking about today is in there. If there's something that I veer off and kind of talk about a different concept, I'll be sure to mention that and say, hey, this isn't in the exercise. All right. So the first part, let me just explain a concept. This one part is not going to be, you're not going to do this as part of the exercise because this is just some background information. When you go to change the color of something or the contrast of something, a lot of times when we do that, we use curves. So if I go to Image Adjustments, Curves, we see this histogram. You can also see that under Window, Histogram as well. And that opens up a panel. I'm going to use, I'll use the panel here. All right, let's close that up. We don't need that. All right, so when you're looking at this histogram indicates how many pixels are in a certain tonal range of your image. And by tonal range, I mean shadows, midtones, and highlights. So shadows are on the left, midtones are in the middle, and highlights are on the right. When I look at this particular image and I look at the histogram, I see a couple interesting things. So just even looking at the image, you ask yourself, are there any pure whites in this image? There are light areas, but as far as pure whites, there's not really any pure whites. Now, are there any blacks? Yeah, there are definitely blacks. There's also quite a bit of dark areas as well. There's quite a bit of highlight areas, but there's no true whites in this image. Now, if you look at the histogram also tells you that same information. Notice that there are no peaks right here. So the higher the peak, the more pixels in that part of the tonal range. Since there are no peaks in this area, this is your pure white at the far right. And then as you go from right to left, you get darker and darker and darker. So black is on the left, white is on the right, and 50% gray would be right in the middle. So we have to get down here to maybe like maybe like a 15% white, like a 15% highlight to actually have some pixels in that part of the tonal range. You can also select part of your image, and then you'll see what part of the histogram that lands in. So if I select this, you can see that those are in the dark areas. If I select this area, you can see that that lands in this area. So even if you thought there were some highlights, some whites in there, you realize, hey, there's no actual true whites. It's bright, but it's not white. It's just a light thing. It's just a highlight. So if you make a selection, you see the histogram for that selection. If you don't have a selection, you see it for the overall composited image. So no bright whites in the highlight area. All right, so why is this important? Why do we care about the histogram? Well, the first thing we're going to do actually is to create this kind of selective focus feel. And what I want to do is blur parts of the image. And we're going to do an interesting twist on this. This is a really interesting technique. Instead of just duplicating this layer and blurring it and then masking out certain parts of it, we're going to split the blur into the upper half of the histogram and the bottom half of the histogram. So we're going to select the top half of the histogram and blur those, and we can select then the bottom half of the histogram and blur those differently. And by being able to blur shadows versus highlights separately and do different creative things with them, it really opens up a lot of possibilities, kind of creative possibilities for creating selective focus. It's a really interesting technique. Now, there's no menu item to create this selection that I'm going to tell you to create. There's similar-ish menu items. For example, if you go to select color range and you choose highlights, that's kind of like what I'm talking about, but notice they break it down into 3 sections: highlights, midtones, and shadows. So for example, if I choose highlights, notice that it's the top like third of the histogram. And then if I deselect that and I go back and select color range and I choose midtones, that's kind of the middle third of that. The specific thing that I'm going to do is to select the top half or the bottom half of the histogram. And for that, there's only a keystroke to hit. And the keystroke is in the exercise. I'm also going to tell you the keystroke. It is Command-Option-2 on the Mac and Control-Alt-2 if you're on Windows. So Command-Option-2, the number 2, or Control-Alt-2 on Windows. That selects the upper half. Now, the keystroke is just for selecting the upper half of the histogram. So if you want the bottom half, you inverse and you get the bottom half. So it's roughly splitting this in half. Highlights versus shadows. And I don't literally mean just highlights versus shadows. When I say highlights and shadows, it's kind of generic. It really is when you're selecting the top half of the histogram, it's really midtones through highlights. And when you're selecting the bottom half, it's really midtones through shadows. I forget, did I say midtones through shadows for both? I meant that. So when you hit that keystroke, just in case I said that wrong, when you hit that Command-Option-2 or Control-Alt-2, it selects midtones through highlights, just in case I said that wrong. And then if you inverse it, you get midtones through shadows. Okay. So we now have these shadow parts, but I don't want to actually destructively blur those on the background layer. I want to duplicate these onto their own layer. Now you can do that with Command-J on the Mac or Control-J on Windows. That is the keystroke for creating a new layer via copy. And that splits your selection off onto its own layer. If I hide the background layer, we see what we have selected. The darker it gets, the more it's selected. The lighter it gets, the less it's selected. So you're only seeing information here up to like midtones. You're not seeing any of the highlights. The highlights are just completely gone. There's nothing really in there, or they're so barely selected in there. They're virtually gone. I'm going to blur this, so I'm going to call this the blurred shadows. They're not blurred just yet, but I'm going to blur them right now. And we'll run a filter on that new layer. We'll run the Gaussian blur, Gaussian, however you want to say it. And I don't need to do it much on this particular image. It's not a high-res image, so we don't want to do too much. If you have a high-res image, you'll have to blur it a bit more when you have a high-res image, but 1 or 2 pixels in this case. Now, this is the really cool part. When you look at this before and after, notice what parts are being blurred. Notice the highlight areas are completely sharp still, or almost exactly fully sharp. The shadows, the darker it gets, the more you see that blurring. So it's already, if we just did this, it's a way to selectively blur just 1/2 of the tonal range, the bottom half of the tonal range. So that's kind of interesting. It kind of gives it this dreamy effect. If you know the movie Sky Captain of Tomorrow, it's an oldish movie now. It's been many years since that came out, but it's got a very interesting look. It was kind of blurry and the color was interesting. It was just a very interesting visual look with Sky Captain of Tomorrow. This kind of reminds me of that kind of dreamy feel that Sky Captain of Tomorrow, that movie had. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now there's all sorts of things you can do with this blurred layer. If it's a little bit too much for your taste, of course you can pull back the opacity so you limit how much you see it. You can also throw in blending modes as well. And this could be for creative effect. With blending modes, I don't want to go into a super big explanation of blending modes, but blending modes blend the current layer into the underlying layers in a variety of different techniques. So these here are going to just simply darken. These are going to lighten, and these are going to crank up contrast. Some will lighten or darken or increase contrast more than others, and so that's why we have all the different ones. They work slightly differently. But let's try, for example, overlay, which will crank up contrast. So the darks get darker, lights might also get lighter if we have light areas on this layer, but we don't really have light areas much on this layer, so it's not increasing contrast very much. in the light areas. It's really only doing it just a little bit in the midtones and more so in the shadows. And so from normal to overlay, so we're still getting that kind of blurry-ish look. It's not quite as blurred as it was, but we're getting a softening of it, but not so much of a blurring, if you will. So we've kind of diminished the amount of blur by blending it into the bottom layer. So I think that softening amount is kind of nice. Now, some parts have gotten a bit too dark. I think we might want to mask out some of this layer in some parts where we might not want to quite go that far. So we can add a layer mask. You can do that through the menu, through layer, layer mask, and you can start by revealing everything. So you could just hide it only where you want to hide it. Or you can click the button down here, which is the same exact thing as that menu. And that will add a blank mask ready for you to paint stuff away. Now, if you're not familiar with the way that masks work, masks hide and show part of an image. And so let me do a quick introduction to masks for those of you who might not know masks. First of all, masks have to be done on a layer that is capable of transparency. In the case of a background layer, now they actually let you create a mask, and what it does is it unlocks the layer. It converts it from a background layer and lets you add a mask. Photoshop didn't used to let you do that. Photoshop used to make you unlock the layer either by clicking the lock or by double-clicking on it and converting it into a regular layer. So depending on how old your version of Photoshop is, you might not just be able to click that mask button. You might have to double-click on the layer to turn it into a regular layer that's capable of transparency, and then you'd be able to add your layer mask. It's nice to see Photoshop taking care of little things like that so that people don't have to know, or even if you know, just you don't have to take the time to convert the background layer into a regular layer. You can just add a mask and Photoshop converts it to a regular layer for you. The mask is white now, which means that it's revealing all of this layer. I can paint on that mask with black. I'm going to choose a big paintbrush here that's hard, and then go ahead and paint. And anywhere that I paint with black on that mask, notice you can see that it's painting with black on the mask, it's hiding the contents of that layer. If I go back and I paint with white, I once again reveal the contents of that layer. So even though it's being hidden, it is not gone. It's not like using the eraser tool. It's like an eraser tool that you can undo at any time. So that's why masks are black and white. It's like an on and off situation. There's no color to a mask because color doesn't matter. It's just, do you see it or do you not? That's a black and white issue, on or off. Black hides, white reveals. Anything in between will do a certain specific amount of opacity. So if I were to paint with a gray, the closer I get to black, the more it's going to hide. The closer I get to white, the more it's going to reveal. So 50% gray, if I go exactly to 50%, that would be a 50% transparency. So I'm going to see through 50%. Okay, so that's the nice thing about masks is masks can be a soft brush. And so even if you're painting with black with a soft brush, you can get nice soft edges. They get you some nice soft transparency, but it's completely non-destructive. You can always get rid of the mask and your photo's still there. If you forget which color to paint with, white or black, here's one way that you can remember it. When you walk into a pitch black room, what do you see? Nothing at all. So black hides. When you shine a white flashlight on something, you illuminate it so you can see it. So white will reveal, black will hide. If you can't even remember that, you have a 50-50 shot. White or black is going to work. If one doesn't, the other one will. So you can only get it wrong once. You'll get it right pretty quick. I'm going to go to this mask. I'm going to paint with black with a soft brush. And if I want to, if I don't want to completely get rid of it, I could lower the opacity of my brush. So that way I could kind of build up and just slowly paint away some of that darkening effect. If I want to change my brush size without having to continue to go up here and play with the size that way, I can use the square bracket keys on my keyboard to change my brush size while I'm doing it. That's the square bracket keys as in, let me just create a document here so I can type in that square bracket just in case you don't know what I mean by square bracket. This is what I mean by the square bracket keys. Left and right square bracket. So left square bracket will left square bracket will shrink it, right square bracket will make it bigger. If you add shift, you'll be doing the softness. So if you watch the icon up here in the options bar, shift right square bracket makes it hard, shift left square bracket makes it soft. I'm hitting that multiple times, so each time it makes it a little softer or a little bigger, just depending on which way you go. All right, so regular brackets, size, shift brackets, softness. I want soft. Okay, so let's go here, and I'm going to go up to a little bit more opacity, paint some of that stuff away. I don't want to darken that stuff too much there. Definitely, I'm going to go to the 100% in this. I like all the detail that we have in the bowl, so I don't want to get rid of that detail. So we're going to paint that back in. Remember, we're hiding the blur shadows layer right now, and that's the one that not only blurs the shadows, but it also darkens it. So wherever we paint black, we're not seeing black, we're seeing that we're hiding this layer. So anything that you like, that you think is pretty cool, just go back in there and paint with black over it so that you bring it back. But I kind of like the more intense light back there, the contrastier light, because if the sun is out, you're going to have contrasty, harsh lighting. Okay, so I think that's pretty cool. Now I do also want to blur some of the highlights. So I'm going to hide that layer, because when you hit that keystroke, the Command Option 2, or on Windows Control Alt 2 to select the top half of the histogram, it does it based on the composite image that you have. So if I leave this layer visible, it's going to make a selection that includes the partially fuzzy things. I don't want that to be factored into it. I want to hide that so that it's just thinking about the image as a sharp image and making a selection based on that. Now I'm going to hit Command Option 2 on the Mac or Control Alt 2 on Windows to select the top half of the histogram. With the background original sharp layer selected, I'm going to duplicate that by either choosing New Layer via copy through the menu or hitting Command or Control J. Now this is the blurred highlights. I'm going to put that on top because I already did the shadows. I haven't actually blurred the highlights yet. Let's go up to the filter menu and do a Gaussian blur or Gaussian blur, however you want to say it. And let's see how this looks. Turn that preview on and off. See, now notice that the highlight areas are being blurred a little bit. And not tremendously, just a little bit. We're just softening it here. But the shadow areas are not. This is just affecting the highlights, not affecting the shadows. Cool. We might not want that everywhere again, so I'm going to go ahead and add another mask. And if there's any parts that I like, I can go there and bring those details back, especially on things that are closer to me. I'm going to make sure that I see all the details in these things that are closer to me. And the things that are a little bit farther away, I'll let them be more fuzzy and blurred out. So anything that I like, I'm going to just paint over those things and bring back some of those nice details. In the end here, if we hide those, we see the beginning. Now, instead of having to click each one of these layers individually, do you know that you can drag through your layers here and hide and show a bunch at the same time? So that's a pretty cool trick. That one's not in the exercise written down. That's just an extra little trick that I want to throw out there. One other thing that's not in the exercise that I'll just throw out there that's kind of a neat trick is Option clicking on a layer on the Mac or Alt clicking on Windows. And when you hold Option or Alt and click on a layer, it hides all the rest. And then when you do it again, it shows all the rest. So it just toggles, so you just see that one layer that you're clicking on. So that way you can see the before and the after. Now, normally when I'm working, I actually like to group all the stuff that I'm working on. We don't actually have you do this in the exercise, but I'm going to do this just to make the before and after really easy to see. I'm going to click on one layer, shift click on another. This is just the retouching that I'm going to do this on. All the retouching and color adjustment layers I'm going to put into a folder. And so I select those, and you can say layer, group layers, which is Command G, or on Windows Control G. Groups all those layers together. And I'll call this retouching and color adjustment. And that way you've got one button to click to turn the whole before and after on and off. There we go. All right. Now, when you're doing these layers, now that we have shadows and highlights as different layers, we can also pull one of the opacities back on one of them if we want to adjust things. Like maybe you went a little too far on the shadows, you could pull those back. If you were just doing both of these layers and you weren't having masks and you weren't having different blend modes and you weren't having different opacities on them, if both layers were exactly the same blend mode with exactly the same opacity, then exactly the same masks, there really wouldn't have been a point to split these into two different layers. The whole idea, the trick behind this is that by splitting them into two different layers, maybe you don't even want to blur one half of it. Maybe you just want to blur one half. It's up to you. But by splitting them into two different layers, we get different control. Like here I did an overlay on the shadows to kind of add the contrast and diminish the amount of blurring there. And we have a different kind of quality for the blurring here. By doing them differently, we have more control than if we had them as one layer. But if all the settings are the same, ultimately, if you blur the shadows and you blur the highlights and you're blurring them equally, guess what? You blurred the whole image. So remember, even though I'm calling this highlights and shadows, it's really shadows through midtones and then midtones through highlights. So don't just make two different layers with the same masks, with the same opacity and the same blend mode. If everything's the same, then you should have just made one layer. And that was not the trick that we wanted to show here. So pretty neat technique there. All right, now that we've got that selective focus part taken care of, now we can go in and do some color adjustment. Now there's a ton of different ways you can do color adjustment. Because we were assuming that not everybody here is Photoshop experts, or else you wouldn't need to learn this stuff. We are going to be using a type of adjustment that we think the visual interface of it kind of makes people understand a little bit more what's going on behind the scenes. Curves is definitely extremely powerful, and you can do all the stuff we're going to show with color balance. You can do that with curves, and you can even do more, but curves is not as intuitive, and so for this demonstration, we thought it was just easier for people to conceptualize what was happening by the nice visual interface that color balance offers. Color balance doesn't offer the most control, but it presents a very nice interface for what it does do. The important thing is we are going to do this as an adjustment layer, not an image adjustment. Because if you do this, if you select a layer, notice first of all I had to select a layer to even be able to do the image adjustment. Image adjustments change that one particular layer, and they're destructive. So they change permanently those pixels. If you do an image adjustment, you save the file, you close it. When you come back tomorrow or later tonight, those pixels were changed. You can't go back to your original pixels unless you had another copy of them somewhere else. So these you have to be very careful about because they are destructive changes. Unlike adjustment layers, which are non-destructive. You can go back, you can see what you've done with them, you can edit them. If you went too far, you can pull them back. They're completely non-destructive. If you don't like the thing that you did, you can change it, or you can just totally delete it and get rid of it. And so this is the preferred way of doing image adjustments whenever possible. When you are doing an image adjustment layer, make sure that you select the topmost layer so that the new layer will be added on top. When you add an adjustment layer, it affects anything underneath it. So that's why you want to make sure that the new layer goes on top of what you want to change. So I'm going to go in here and do a color balance. By the way, you can use the menu, or you can use this little menu right down here, which does exactly the same thing. There's only one subtle difference. If you do this menu down below, see how it just creates the layer, doesn't ask you to name it? If you do go up to this menu and choose the same color balance, this one asks you to name it beforehand. Of course, you can always name it afterwards right there in the panel, but this one does ask you before you create it to name it. I'm going to call this overall color. We're going to do the kind of reimagining of the color right now. Let's close that histogram. Let's put that over there just in case we want it later, but I don't think we're going to need that. Okay, so here we get a visual representation of what you can do to change the color. You can go warmer or cooler, and that's what I like about this, that even though you can go warmer or cooler in curves, curves doesn't visually show you that. You just have to know how to work it. So for demonstrating to people that are learning the concept of color change, that it tells you yellow and blue are opposites, I think is very nice to initially learn how to do color correction. Yellow and blue, warm versus yellow, those are opposites. I think that's kind of easy for people to conceptualize in their mind. Maybe magenta and green, you might not necessarily have known that those were opposites, or cyan and red, but at least the concept of warm versus cool, you can't be warm and cool at the same time. You can be hot and then cold and hot and then cold, but you can have like hot flashes and go back and forth. But if you're both hot and cold at the same time, it means you're neutral. You're neither hot nor cold. You can't be both. It's a slider. You go one way or you go the other way. You can't be yellow and blue. If you're equally yellow and blue, that means you're neutral. You're in between. Before we change anything here, we need to think about what section of the tonal range we are changing: shadows, midtones, or highlights. It starts on midtones because that's normally, for most images, that's the predominant tone within the image where you're going to see the biggest change. I say normally, it just depends on the image. Some images are very high key images that have a lot of bright areas, and so they might be a lot more highlights. Some areas are very dark and brooding and they have more shadows. It just depends on the image. Let's start with the shadows actually and work our way down. Now, if you're thinking about light versus dark in an outdoor area, the sunlight would be hitting the highlights. So sunlight would be warm, so the highlights need some warmth. But shadows are typically cooler because the sunlight isn't getting to those. So maybe we can make the shadows a little bit cooler and the highlight areas a bit warmer to create some interesting color within here. So I could make this a little bit cooler between cyan and red. Right? I could make this a little bit cooler there. Notice the shadow, the shading that's happening here. Or I can make them a bit warmer if I want. Could change that. I don't need to make them much cooler here. Let's just make them a little teeny bit there. And then I can also go to the yellow, and this is where we can add a decent amount of this, like so. And I can turn this on and off just to see the progress that I'm making. Now, it is affecting some other parts as well. It's starting with the shadows. Doesn't change the highlights very much. Definitely is changing the shadow areas. Now that I see this, it might be a little bit too cool. Let's go back here to the cyan, play with it. If it is out in the sun, maybe this looks a little bit better with some red in it, actually. I kind of like some of the red. That looks kind of nice. So it's still got the cool from the blue, but I think the red gives it a little bit more of a purpley blue kind of feel that I like. Okay, now let's switch over to midtones. We're going to see more of the image change here now. So we definitely want to add some yellow in here. I'm going to go more towards the yellow, bring out some of the warmth there. We're going to see most of that change in the highlight area, so I'm going to leave that for the highlight area, I think. I think overall I don't like the kind of coolness of this, so I'm going to go more towards the red here in the midtone area. I like that color change that I'm getting towards. Now let's go to the highlights. This is where we really want to push in a bunch of yellow for sure. I want to put in a bunch of yellow there. And also some warmth with some red as well, because really sunlight is orange. And so yellow plus red equals orange. So you don't want to just put in yellow. If I put this back to 0, it looks just kind of yellowy when you do that. Don't forget to put in some red, and sometimes maybe a little magenta might also look nice, but you got to be careful about it going too pink on that. But you can play around with it depending on the image. And so even just doing that is, wow, what a change. Now it feels like this extra contrast that we added with the yellow really feels more like sun. And that's why we cranked up the contrast and then changed the color. So it feels like a blaring hot sun is out there. That's kind of the feeling that we wanted to go for. We're fine losing some of the details. We didn't necessarily like those details. We're going more for a feeling like a soft summer fun day. Now, just to show some interesting creative techniques that you can do here if you want. And again, any of these things that you don't like, you don't have to do them on your images. Just understand that the concepts are there for when they're appropriate. You know, these kind of things can be great for stock photography. If you want to get a stock photo that you kind of like, but you want to change the feel of it so it's different from maybe other websites that have used it, you can apply these concepts to your own photography or stock photography. Adjustment layers have layer masks. Now, layer masks are places where you can paint and you can put pixels. If I go to my paintbrush and I paint with black, let's go to a bigger brush here, I'm going to paint away this bright yellow sun adjustment, and I'm going to go back to the original photo, the one that was underneath. Not that I want to do that in a big swatch there, but let's go back and use my white to paint back over there. In fact, let me just undo and step backwards just in case I missed an area there. I don't want to miss a little teeny area. You can paint, of course, but something you might not think about is running filters on a mask. A mask is just a black and white image, so you can run filters on it. For example, adding noise would add some black specks. What does black do? It hides. So if you add some noise, I'm going to do some Gaussian noise, which makes it a bit more random. Uniform is more even. It's also a little bit darker. There's some darker and lighter spots. There's kind of more variation between them. Let's go to, probably don't need to go much, maybe like 50%, I think, and this is fine. If I zoom in, now you can see those little black areas that it created are showing through to the original bluer version of the image that's underlying this. Now you might say, well, that's a little too strong. And if I was just doing the noise, I would probably bring this back. This is kind of to give it like a rougher feel, but we actually want it to be a little bit stronger than we want, because I'm going to run another filter, which is going to weaken this a little bit. So I'm just adding some noise, and it doesn't really matter so much what the filter is. Just think that you can run filters on masks to add textures and create interesting effects. We're going to run another filter here from the filter gallery. Let's pull this over here so we can see this. Oh, actually, we can't see it while we're doing it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So we'll go with filter gallery. Now, with filter gallery, there's all sorts of, just tons of different filters in here. The one that we're interested in is under brush strokes, and it's called angled strokes. The whole idea of this brush strokes area is that it takes whatever you have on your current layer, or in this case, a mask, and it treats it like ink that you can do things with. Like you can smear it, you can spray it, and in the case of angled strokes, you can drag a brush. It's like, think of it like you're dragging a physical brush over wet ink, and when you have wet ink and you drag a brush over it, it smears. So you can smear it in different directions, just maybe in one direction or in a crosshatch, so you drag it in both directions. You can drag longer or shorter. So here you didn't drag much, so there wasn't much smearing. You can drag a longer stroke. Now the longer you drag, the more you smear it, it gets lighter. By making it lighter, you're not going to see the effect as much once we have it on the layer mask. The darker this mask is, the more it's going to hide this layer, so you're going to see more of that blue come through. I think something like this will look pretty good. So let's click OK. If I zoom in there closely, you can see, hopefully in the live stream here, this is coming through, that there's some streaks of that blue, that original color, the underlying blue that's coming through. It's very subtle. It's meant to be very subtle. When you zoom out, you can kind of see some of the texture, but it kind of looks like just kind of scratchy, like old photo kind of feel. And we like that texture. If you don't like the texture, by all means, you don't have to do it. But just wanted to kind of get you thinking about interesting, creative ways to do things. That's the whole idea of the seminar, is to kind of inspire interesting, different photographic techniques that you can do to your images to make them more unique, and especially stock stuff. Everybody's getting stock stuff these days, and instead of just using it as it is, customize it to make it your own. Imagine the difference between this and this in terms of the feeling. You might see a subject you like, but you're like, oh, it just doesn't feel quite right, but I like the subject. Well, you can reimagine it. You can do different stuff. So, next up, down on the bottom here, there's this slate slab, and then you've got the wall, and then you've got these floorboards over here. Let's make there be a little bit different color here, because a lot of this stuff is all kind of similar-ish color. So let's accentuate the difference in color. Really, the slate, let's make the slate and the wall a little bit more green, so it stands out a little bit more. And that's going to be a little bit tricky to do, because all of this stuff is, there's tons of different shapes in here. There is a lot of this is pretty similar in color. It's not exactly the same color, but it's kind of similar in color. So there's a million different selection techniques that we can use. We're going to take a look at one, and this does not have to be a perfect selection in this case, because we're not going to do a major change here. We're just going to do a little bit of a minor change, but this is going to be a little bit of a tricky selection. We're going to start by going here to the background layer just to select that, and so that we don't accidentally edit one of these masks that we might be on. Just going to go back to that background layer, and we're going to go do a color range. We're going to try to select this based on color. Even though they're pretty similar in color, let's see if we can have it figure out by color. We'll choose color range here. All right, now let's go back to sampled colors. So in here you've got your eyedropper, and you're going to click on a color to select it, and this fuzziness slider, if you've ever used the magic wand, it's like the tolerance. I don't know why they call it tolerance on the magic wand and fuzziness here, because it's essentially the same thing. Really, the magic wand and select color range are basically the same thing, except that select color range works on the whole document, or if you have a selection, it only works in your selection. But the magic wand, you can kind of click and you can localize it to an area, which you can actually even do here if you choose localized color clusters. That actually even lets you limit the range within select color range. I don't think that's going to help us in this case. I played around with it, but I didn't really find that helped a whole lot in this case. So maybe something like that gives me mostly this, which is pretty good. Now I need other areas, so I'm going to need to shift click to add to my selection. And I'm going to need to shift click a couple times on some different parts of this to select these areas. And unfortunately, it is selecting the floorboards, which I don't want. So I can option click or alt click to deselect those. And then it's deselecting this. So sometimes if it doesn't work right, you can cancel this or come back in. Or if you just want to start over again, you can just click again. Anytime you click with the eyedropper, it will reselect a singular color that you're clicking on. If you shift click, you're adding to the color. But always be careful, because if you ever just do a single click again, boom, you just got rid of all the stuff you just did, and you're switching to the singular color that you're clicking on. Now, if you get tired of shift clicking and you want to select a bunch of colors, you can actually shift drag to select a range of colors. Just be really careful with shift dragging, because that can really quickly select a lot of your image, and you have to be careful with that. So I'm just going to click again to just kind of reset that, and try shift clicking again, shift clicking. And yeah, it's just not going to do such a great job there, but at least it did give me some of this stuff the way that I want to select it. I'm going to have to manually take care of this, but at least I did get this selected half decently. It's just not going to let me exclude this part. So not a perfect selection, but it's a start of a selection at least. So we'll click OK. Now, if I want to edit the selection this way, it's really hard seeing these marching ants. I don't get a visual sense of what's selected, what's not selected here when I'm looking at this. There's a better mode for visually seeing your selection, which is called Quick Mask mode. Over here in the toolbar, we have Quick Mask. Now, I've talked about layer masks over here, and I know that those are layer masks, and this is Quick Mask. Don't think of that term mask as something that kind of ties all of these things together, and that whenever you hear mask, that mask means the same thing. The concept of masking is to kind of work with something or not work with something. So in that case, these are all masks. A layer mask is, are you going to see the layer or not? So that's what a layer opacity mask is. In the case of quick mask is, are you going to select something or not? So there's always this kind of concept of on or off. But is it selected or not selected in the case of quick mask? Or is it visible or not visible in the case of layer masks? So don't be confused by the term mask. It's just on or off. Are you going to do something with it or not? So with the case of a quick mask, when you go into quick mask, it turns your selection into a pixel-based version, so that it's, instead of those marching ants, you now see it as pixels. Now, what does the color indicate is a really important thing. I'm going to click out of Quick Mask, and I'm going to double click on the Quick Mask button. Color by default indicates a masked area, which means a non-selected area. So in this case, this is if you had ever done what's called a rubilinth before. That's actually why this is red. A rubilinth was the idea that you kind of block off the areas that you don't want to work with, and what you're left over with is the area that you do want to work with. That's the default of this. The color is like the masked areas, the unselected areas, and the parts that look normal, those are the areas that you are working with. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, being used to computers, when I highlight something, the thing that has the color to me is the thing that is selected. So even though this is the default of Photoshop, to me it just is odd. So I like to switch it to selected areas. This is a personal choice. What I think is intuitive. I've talked to a lot of other people and they also find that it's intuitive, but if you like working with masked areas, by all means you can do that. It is a personal decision. That's why they give you the option. So now that the color indicates selected areas, wherever you see red, that means it is selected. All right, now we can paint using painting tools, because as long as we're in Quick Mask mode, we are refining our selection. If we ever leave Quick Mask mode and go back to standard mode, we see the selection is turned back into the marching ants, and that's an actual selection we can do something with. The whole point of Quick Mask mode is to edit a selection using pixel-based tools. It's quick because you can go in and you can go out, and it's a cool way to be able to edit your selections. Behind the scenes is actually using channels to do this, but you don't have to save a channel and then delete the channel. And that's actually why they call it Quick Mask, because it kind of gives you the ability to use channels to make selections, but it's much quicker. And that's why they call it Quick Mask. At least I think so. Mentally, that makes sense to me. I don't know if that's originally why they called it that way. So one click to go in. There we go. When we paint with black, in this case, I'm seeing red, which means that will eventually be selected. Technically, it's not selected yet because I'd have to leave Quick Mask mode and then it will be selected. When I'm in Quick Mask mode, I'm just editing the thing that will become a selection. You can use a hard edge brush or a soft edge brush, which is the really cool thing about Quick Mask mode, because you can do both hard and soft edges to your selection. Now, I would take time doing this the correct way, but for this demo, I'm just going to do it kind of quickly and not worry about being too precise with it. I'm going to go in there and paint in those shadows because I want to color all of that stuff. You can zoom in as necessary, like so. I don't want this to be selected, so I'm going to paint with white. Kind of like a layer mask, it's an on or off kind of concept. Selected, not selected. So white will deselect and black will select. Again, if you cannot remember that, you've got a 50-50 shot. Try one of them. If it does not work, the other one will. So I don't want this stuff to be selected because I'm going to be changing the wall color to be like a greener color, and then also the slate. I also want to change the color of that. So anything that's selected, I'm going to be making it more green. Now, when it comes to a straight line like this, trying to paint a straight line is really quite tedious. So I got a trick for you here. Let me create a new document so I can show you this neat little painting trick here. If you're ever painting and you click, you just get two dots. But if you shift click, you'll get a straight line between those dots. So click, 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 or shift click. Here I'm holding shift each time I click, and that's an easy way to get a straight line. So I can come in here with a smaller brush. I can click, and then I can shift click, and bam, got a nice straight line like that. I don't want any of that to become green. Come in here. Now I'm going to switch over to black. Paint that in, then switch back over to white, click, shift click, click, shift click. There we go. Okay, and like I said, I'm not going to do this totally perfectly like I would if I was doing this in a real project, but I will just do it so it's good enough just for this demo, just so we get the idea. Here's a lot of straight edges, so I'd click, shift click, shift click, shift click, shift click. Lots of shift clicking there. And then I could just take care of the inside like so. All right. Not too bad. Oh, I do need to switch over to black and then fill in all of this stuff because I want that to all be changed. I'm going to soften up my brush just a little bit. Be careful of having too hard of a brush when you're painting in the middle of stuff like this, because you can sometimes see the harsh edge of the brush as you paint if you're not careful. All right. Now, if I ever do want to deselect something partially, so maybe I want this to be a little bit green, but maybe not too much, I could go in with maybe like a 50% gray or something. And if you paint with a gray, that will be partially selected, and therefore it would be partially getting the color change that I'm going to do. So it wouldn't be getting as much of it, but it would be getting some of it. Let me switch over to white and deselect these parts because I don't want those to be changed. Switch back over to gray and lighten that. You can also, if you just want to lighten something, like this stuff is, let me actually undo that. Because this is a selection, or because this is basically a pixel-based version of your selection, you can select an area, like so. And you can go in. Now this, I want to do either a levels or a curves adjustment to lighten this. This you have to do through image adjustments because you don't have layers within Quick Mask. It's just a temporary thing. This isn't in your exercise that's provided. This is just a little bonus kind of bit of information. You could then take your darkest part right here and brighten that up. So we would pull that up. And so this is lightening those dark parts because you're taking your black and you're making it lighter by pulling it up. The cool thing of Quick Mask is that you can use any selection technique, any brush technique, or any pixel-based editing technique to edit your selection. So you've turned your selection into pixels, and you can run filters in here. You can use paintbrushes. You can use selections to do things, whatever you want. It's a selection as pixels. When you're all done, then you can go back into standard mode. So you're leaving Quick Mask mode, and now you have that as a selection. Now you can do something with it. I'll go back to my top layer here and keep adding on top of that. And we're going to do another color adjustment layer, color balance layer. And we'll call this green, slate, and wall. Like so. All right. And let's go into let's start with the midtones and just bump in a bunch of green in here. Just to show the before and after here. And we don't see a whole lot of green there, so we're probably going to see more in the highlight area. Put in more there. So here you don't need to go even nearly as much because, whoa, that's a little too saturated. That's like scary haunted house kind of stuff. So maybe just a little teeny bit there. We could also, while we're doing it, we could go a little bit warmer, right? Do you want a cooler green or a warmer green? And really this depends on you. Like I really kind of like this color, but if you want it more warm, you can go more towards the yellow. Just depends on kind of the color you want to go for. It's kind of up to you. And if you're not sure, if you don't have a vision in your mind, just be creative. Just play with it and see what looks good. You know, you don't have to know what you want when you're coming in here. You can just say, hey, let's just try it out and see which way do I like. Do I like kind of, oh man, that's a little too broody for me, you know, but that's kind of too limey for me. So maybe then you just don't change that one. So you can play with it and see what feels right to you. And you know, if you're changing it and it doesn't look good, then maybe you just don't end up changing those at all, and you just change some of the other ones. All right, so there we've kind of bumped up some of the wall color green a little bit. Change that color. Okay, let's say we like that. The reds in the grill, I want to make those pop because this is all about this grill here. So let's make some reds to stand out against this. Red and green are complementary colors, so they'll stand out against each other and create some more contrast in the color, not just contrast in the brightness and contrast. All right, now that is very, very circular here. It's not a perfect circle, but it's a very smooth curve. And for that, I think it's probably easiest to make a pen tool selection. We could try to paint that. Certainly one thing we could do, but we wanted to be able to talk about more tools and show you more things. So I think the pen is a good thing to use in this case. Now, when you use the pen, you can create paths, and paths can be turned into selections. But you have to make sure that you're not creating a shape layer, which will be a visible graphic shape in your image. That's the default. We want to switch to path after we've chosen this pen tool. The path will draw, and then we'll turn that into a selection. Now, with this tool takes a bit of practice to get good with. We teach this in lots of different classes. We teach it in InDesign, in Illustrator, and Photoshop, and really any vector tool. We pretty much teach this pen tool for drawing. It's easy to create straight lines because you just click, click, click. That's the easier part. The harder part is the curves. For curves, what you're doing is you're drawing, you're dragging, you're clicking and dragging up, and these handles point the direction to the next point that you're going to create. So if I come over here and drag, see now I've created an actual curve. These handles, the distance of them, so the size, that controls how much you're pushing it in that direction, but also the direction of them themselves change how it's entering or exiting that point. So if you're going to click here, you're making your line start there, but which direction is it going to initially head in? Let's say we drag up. It's going to start going up. When you put your next point, that determines where you're going to end up, but the line started going up before it went to that point. For example, if I undo that and I come over here and I click over here, the line started going up before it went over to this side. So the initial click and drag determines starting point and starting direction. When you end up somewhere, when you click and hold the mouse and drag, that determines where you're going to end up and the direction at which you're going to enter that point. Okay. Rough rule of thumb, if you're going to make a curve, you're clicking and dragging at the start and the end of that curve. Do not drag from one point to the next. You're dragging in the direction the line is starting to head. If it's starting to head up, drag up. Then you come to the last point, and now, if this is going to go up, and then it's coming back down, drag in the direction the line is heading. So if the line is heading down, be dragging down. If the line is heading up, be dragging up. This is one motion. Click, hold the mouse, and drag. Let go. Click, hold the mouse, and let go. Okay, it takes a little muscle memory to get good at that. If you've ever tried this before and it wasn't quite that easy, I know I've taught a lot of people, and there's kind of a point where it clicks in, and people get frustrated sometimes before it kind of starts making sense. And it's totally not. There's nothing in real life that has prepared you to use the pen tool. It's its own kind of concept. So let's draw this path here. I'm going to click and drag. Oh, and I missed the spot there a little bit, so let me just undo. I'm going to click and drag. And since I want to end up maybe about there, I'm just going to start dragging in the line, in the direction this line is heading. I know it's going there, but if you look at this handle, it's kind of heading in this direction. And then I come over here. See now, check this out. I'm going to delete that again. If I really pull far, and then I come here, see how I come way, way out. So it takes some practice to get good at estimating how far you have to drag. I generally tell people, when in doubt, keep your drags shorter. until you get better and knowing that you can drag a bit longer. So I'd rather drag a shorter drag than a longer drag, because if you drag too long to the next point and then you drag here, your line can start to bind up with each other and it can start to create kind of crooked, not so great lines. But a rough rule of thumb that you can keep in mind is if you're starting from here and you're ending there, drag about a third of the way to the next point. So from here to about a third. And you're kind of keeping to the outside a little bit, because this gives it an initial shove in the right direction, but it is going to head towards that other point. So it's never actually going to get to this line. See when I come here? See how it doesn't actually get to that line? All right. So see, if both of these handles are about a third of the total distance, you kind of get a fairly nice smooth curve in there. And even if you aren't quite perfect, like I wasn't quite perfect there, I can come back later and edit that. And I'm going to come over here, click and drag, and then end up here, click and drag. Now, if you get here where it's not going in a smooth curve anymore, it needs to start heading straight up, you have to hold Option on the Mac or Alt on Windows to change this handle here so you can point it in a new direction. Then I can come up here, and this is really just a straight part. So I just click, then come back over here to this and click. The pen tool is just for initially drawing. If you want to come back and edit, you come back to one of your path or direct selection tools. The path selection tool moves the whole path. The direct selection edits points within that path, and that is your editing tool. You're going to come in here, click on individual points to show the handles, and then you can change the angle, you can change the distance, and you can get this path to be correct. As long as the points have been laid down in the right area, it's just really a matter of moving them and adjusting the handles to get them to be where you want them to be. So you can change the angle, move the point there a little bit, and that ends up being pretty good there, like so. Once you're done drawing that, you need to save this path so that you don't accidentally lose it in the future. You can only ever have one work path, and if you were to deselect that and start drawing, the old work path would disappear and you would replace it with the new one. So if you want to save it, double click and give it a name. Now that will be saved in your file, and they don't take up much space in your file. Once you have a path that you like, you can go into the menu over here and say, make a selection from that path. A lot of times on photos, things aren't super sharp. You probably want to have a little bit of feathering or a little bit of softness on here. Maybe like 1 or 2 pixels is probably all you need in this particular case, but it depends on your photo as to how much you will need for your selections. That gives me the basic shape of the bowl, but there are parts in here that I don't want. I'm going to go back into quick selection mode. Now we see that that is a pretty nice selection. I like that. It's looking pretty good. I'm going to go to my brush tool now. Go in hard. This is kind of a hard edge thing, so I'm going to go to a hard edge here. And oh, I need to paint with black. Let me undo that. Just realized I was painting with gray. That's why this default button is here. Default foreground and background. It's the letter D. If you hit D on your keyboard, you hit that. That gives you pure white and pure black. And that's a really nice thing to be able to reset really quickly to white and black for the purposes of layer masks or quick masks. Because you want to hide or show in the case of layer masks, or in the case of quick masks like I'm doing right now, you can edit your selection. Deselect something that you don't want. Now, if I was just doing the bowl, that would be good. But I might want to, if I'm bumping up the reds in here, I might want to also kind of bring some red elsewhere in the image. And since I'm painting, I could go in here with maybe a nice soft brush and paint in a little bit of stuff here. I could go with a lower opacity and just, I need to paint with black here, just hit a little bit here. And actually red in this particular case is kind of appropriate because I know I'm going to end up making this selection wherever I've selected this. I'm actually going to add some red. So this kind of gives me a little bit of an idea of how it might actually look once I hit some of these areas with some red. I'm going to kind of be like enhancing the rust, if you will, in some of these areas because I kind of like that idea. All right. And maybe I want to also do these. These would probably be kind of rusty. So I'm going to go with a very small brush that's appropriate. I'm using my left and right square bracket keys to size that. And again, that trick of click, shift click, shift click, click, shift click. And I can hit those with a little red later on. Now remember, right now I'm only working on my selection. So when I'm all done, I need to leave quick mask mode, go back to standard mode. Now I have a selection. Even if you don't see the marching ants, it is selected. The marching ants only march around anything that's 50% or more selected. If I go back into quick mask, you'll see that that is still there. So it is selected. It's just not more than 50% selected. It's less than 50% selected. Then I can come back in and add some reds to this. Let's go in and do another color balance. We'll call this reddish bowl and struts. And we'll go in, we'll add some red to it. This is the midtones that I'm working with right now. Maybe also a little yellow. We can change the tint between like a more purplish or a more orangish kind of red. Go to the highlights. Yeah, it's kind of nice. Ooh, there we go. Put a little fire in that red. Just don't go too much. Still want it to look realistic. Yeah, there we go. Popping out red, bright color, bright sunny day. It's reflecting on that thing. That's better. Getting more pop in color there. All right. Now there might be some areas that I want to brighten up, and maybe I just want to hit some areas by kind of just maybe painting over them. You don't have to make a selection first before you go into quick mask mode. You can use quick mask mode to make your initial selection of areas that you might want to retouch. So with no selection pre-made, I can just go into quick mask, and I could use my paintbrush with black and paint over areas that I might want to, and I'm going to paint with 100% opacity now. I can paint over areas that I might want to lighten. Maybe I want to lighten this a little teeny bit. Maybe any place I want people to kind of look. Maybe some of this in here, and maybe I don't want to go with a full opacity there. Maybe I want to come back. This is where if I had a Wacom tablet with some pressure sensitivity, this would be really nice to give more subtle painting. Don't have a tablet with me today, but definitely investing in a Wacom tablet, pressure sensitive tablet, can be nice because then you can vary your amount of opacity based on your pen pressure. Maybe some of this I want to lighten up just a little teeny bit. So let's say those are the areas that I want to lighten, and yeah, let's say that's good. When you're done, you just come out of quick mask mode and you just created a selection in quick mask mode. Now I can go in and do a layer adjustment. This time we're going to do curves to brighten this up. I'm going to call it brighten. And for curves, if you want to make the light areas brighter, you can pull this white point over, and that will brighten starting with the brightest brights. I don't want to do too much there. Now then, after you've got your brightest brights changed, so things that used to be kind of a gray have been remapped over to white. See, I'm moving the white point over, and that remaps these tones that used to be gray, now they're white. You can also work within the curve as well. Let's make this a little bigger so you can see this better. If you pull the highlight areas, not the white, but the highlight areas, if you pull them up, you brighten those. But maybe you still want a little contrast in there, so maybe you want to crank up the contrast. You can darken the darks back down again here, because here I'm working with the shadows. So drag up to lighten and drag down to darken. There we go. There's more contrast. There's more light. There's more contrast. Cool. I'm liking that. One final thing here to end this. We're going to add one final layer here just for an overall kind of adjustment, which we'll do a final hue saturation over the whole image. Now that we see the whole image, we might want to go in and say, hey, let's bump up some color here, drop some color there, and just kind of do an overall saturation and brightness on this. Of course, we can come back in and do individual layers and diminish how much those look. But if you want to kind of do an overall hit across everything, across all the layers that you've done, sometimes throwing in a layer on top just lets you have this kind of overall grand vision of, hey, does everything need a little more saturation or a little less? You can also go into specific tonal ranges, like maybe you think that the reds need a little bit of work, so maybe the reds need more or less saturation. You could also, while you're at it too there, you could lighten or darken based on those color areas as well. You could also say, hey, let's go maybe into the blues and maybe saturate those a little bit more. Oh, no, not a whole lot of this image is blues, is it? So a couple things about this is you can go with those pre-made selection areas, or if you want to go to a certain tonal range, like for example, like let's say you said greens. Well, there are definitely some greens in here. Let's saturate the greens. You're like, hey, not much, I guess, is considered green. Well, you can go to your eyedropper and you can sample something and see they actually considered that more of a yellow than a green. And then you targeted your exact part of the tonal range, your exact color, and you can target that individually. Okay. And so let's go back to the master. Maybe we could desaturate a little bit. I think we went a little bit much on the color saturation there. We'll just pull back just a little tiny bit. So in the end, we have really brightened the whole thing up. We've increased the contrast to make it feel like a brighter, sunnier day, made it a little bit soft and organic, and kind of made it a little bit more interesting than just such a clean, harsh, detailed, kind of boring photo, and made it a little more exciting. So that is what we had planned for today. Just as a reminder, if you want to go and try this out yourself, we have an exercise step-by-step. If you check out our goodies page, just scroll down on the goodies page. You're going to nobledesktop.com/goodies. The address for this will be in the video description down below if you're watching the recording. For those of you attending live, I just pasted it into the chat. You just scroll down here. You can download the PDF instructions that go through what I showed today, download the class files, which are the images that I demonstrated on, and everything is written down here for you. Definitely for this particular image, take some creative control, play around with things, experiment. There's not any set rules for what you have to do. It's all kind of creative vision, and hopefully these concepts can be used on other images so that you can make your imagery, whether it's your imagery or stock imagery, more interesting in the future. If you like these kind of step-by-step instructions, if you like going through and learning, check out our books. We've got all sorts of books on Photoshop, Illustrator, web design, and some. So if you want to learn more, you can definitely check those out. So for example, if you're just getting started, we've got a beginning Photoshop book. If you want more advanced retouching, we've got a Photoshop Advanced. If you're interested in Photoshop for web design or animated GIFs, we've got a variety of things. If you want to retouch hair, we got a hair book as well. If you've got some more Photoshop experience, you want to get more into complex hair selections. So a variety of training that you can get into. And you can also take any of those as classes as well. And those classes you can attend live in New York City or live online as well. So people will come to New York City and take the class, and you can tune into that same class, just screen share into the instructor's computer, hear them talking, and see the same thing that all the people in person are seeing. You're just tuning in online. So thank you very much for watching today. Hope you enjoyed, and hope to see you in a future live stream. Be sure to give a thumbs up to this video, like it down below if you liked it, subscribe to our channel for future notifications, and hope to see you in a future live stream. Thanks a lot for coming.